Back in September 2019, I ended up meeting up with a girl in the comments section of a Facebook post. She was really pretty and seemed really cool, so after a few weeks of talking, I decided to drive all the way from White Plains to Pittsburgh just so we could hang out for a weekend. I remember a friend asking something to the effect of, "Have you talked to her much on the phone?" And I told him we'd spoken a little, but that we'd mostly talked via text and Facebook Messenger. And he recommended that we talk in long form and about a lot of different stuff too. Otherwise, I might get a nasty surprise. Well, I guess he was right. And now I won't bore you with all of the details, but let's just say me and this girl weren't nearly as compatible as I'd hoped. And then while I'd originally planned on staying the whole weekend so me and her could get some food, maybe catch a movie, I decided to just cut my losses and drive back to New York on Saturday evening. I figured if I hit the road at around 7 p.m. I could be back home by around 1 the next morning. And no doubt I'd be exhausted by the time I got home, but not too beat that I'd risk getting into an accident or anything. So with my mind made up, that's what I did. After getting a quick bite to eat, I was on the 22 by 7:30, and then after 3 hours of driving with the setting sun in my rear view, I saw a sign for Rosecrans, PA. It had been dark for maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and I remember seeing a Sunoco gas station all lit up just off the highway to my left. Then just a mile or two up the road, and in timeless fashion, my gas gauge lit up with a low gas warning. Maybe that's just my luck, that it never lights up as I'm approaching a gas station, only ever when it's just a speck in my rear view. But I was also driving on one of those divided highways, the kind with a whole-ass miniature park between the two stretches of highway, and this obviously meant that there was no turning around for miles. And then I asked my phone, "Hey Siri, where's the next gas station?" And then my phone started talking about another gas station that I'd find if I turned onto US 15. I'd have to drive another 20 to 30 minutes or so, but it was there, and I wasn't about to run out of gas and get stranded like an idiot. And I remember checking the highway ahead of me and not seeing any other cars behind me or ahead of me, so I thought it was safe to actually look at my phone screen to make sure that I'd take the right turn. And I swear to God, I looked for no longer than 2 seconds at the most, and then when I brought my eyes back to the road, there she was, dead ahead of me. I slammed on my brakes, almost giving myself whiplash in the process, but I kept control of my car. The girl went from being a faintly lit shape on the furthest and dimmest reaches of my headlights to being only 5 feet in front of me. And while my first instincts were to yell, "Are you effing crazy?" at her, I quickly realized why she'd been walking in the middle of the highway. She looked to be in a bad way. Her clothes were all torn up, and there was blood in her hair from what looked like a head wound, and I didn't see it until she climbed into my passenger seat, but she wasn't wearing any shoes either. The moment my car stopped, she limped around to my passenger side and then tried to open up the door. I keep it locked out of habit, so her first attempt did nothing but make a dull wrenching sound, but that was soon followed by this blood-curdling screech of, "Open the door, I'm begging you, please!" I still had zero clue what was going on, so my first reaction was to spin around in my seat just in case who or whatever had hurt her was close by. I didn't open my car door right away, because obviously if I was going to carjack someone, using a pretty girl in distress as bait seems like a very effective tactic. But when I didn't see anyone, and when the girl gave me another very convincing cry of "please help me," I guess that seeing the blood up close and hearing the genuine terror in her scream, they kind of overrode my paranoia. Then after taking one final look at her, I unlocked my car, and she practically dove into the back seat before slamming the door closed behind her. And as I took off again, she says, "Mister, we need to move. We're not going fast enough. They're going to catch us." And so I put my foot down as I asked who they were. She said she didn't know. They just took her. And it was then that I noticed the handcuffs around her left wrist. One cuff was still locked around it, but the other just hung there awkwardly. I didn't need any more information other than that. I just put my foot down and burned rubber for a few miles till I thought that we were at a safe distance. I checked my rear view a few times, and then when I didn't see any lights, I slowed from around 70 to a pretty safe 35. But as we started to slow, the girl started yelling. And she says, "Why are you slowing down?" And before I could even answer, she says, "Go faster, what are you doing? They're going to be following me." I'm kind of freaking out internally, but I told her there was no one in sight, and we also wouldn't be going anywhere if a cop came the other way and caught us doing a buck and change. But then she says, "You don't get it. We want the cops. If those guys catch me, they'll kill you too." And I guess when you think about it, I didn't doubt that. If whoever she was talking about had been willing to handcuff her before trying to crack her head open, I have no doubt that they'd put a bullet in me to get her back. It was also kind of a relief to hear that thing about the cops too, because when I saw the handcuffs, there was a part of me that thought, Jesus, please don't accidentally be harboring a fugitive right now. But it wasn't the cops she was running from. I sped up a little, pushing things back up to 60 plus so we were moving without breaking any speed limits. And then I was checking my rear view every other second, expecting a pair of headlights to appear. And that's when I remembered my goddamn gas tank and how it was almost empty. As you can imagine, the girl was not excited when I told her that we needed to stop for gas at the next town. She didn't want to believe it at first, that the driver she thought was going to save her had a fuel gauge in the red, and she started freaking out in the passenger seat, screaming the F word over and over until I managed to talk her down. I put my foot down again, picked up some speed, and then told her to call the cops and tell them to meet us at that gas station that we were about to pull to. The girl grabbed my phone from the dash and called 911, and then over the next minute or so, I listened to what she said and got a little more info on what had happened. She didn't go into too much detail, but after telling the cops where we were going, she explained to the dispatcher that she'd been kidnapped, taken someplace out in the woods, then handcuffed to a metal pipe which she'd broken to get free. She said, "I don't know a lot, so I'm assuming in response to questions like, who were they or where exactly are you right now?" But I also learned that she'd been held for a couple of days by that point, and whoever had been holding her captive had done some disgusting and evil stuff to her. It was no coincidence that when she started detailing some of the stuff she'd endured, I noticed my speed gauge creeping up to 75. It was making my skin want to crawl off my bones just listening to the stuff those creeps did to her. And in my head, I guess I imagined them to look something like monsters. Little did I know, I'd be meeting them sooner than I thought. So we kept on speeding down the highway until we reached the turn that I'd read about, and then after maybe 5 more minutes of rolling through small-town Pennsylvania and sticking to the speed limit, we came to that gas station where we were supposed to meet the cops. But they were nowhere to be seen, and when she realized this, the girl started to freak out again. She started yelling at me, saying, "Where are they? They said they'd be here. Where are they?" And I tried to calm her down by explaining they were probably on their way. But this did nothing to keep her calm. For a few minutes, the girl sat in my passenger seat, watching a car pass here and there and getting super freaked out about who it might be. Then when a car pulled into the gas station and stopped at a pump, she says, "Oh, screw this. I'm getting out of here." She then jumped out of my car and ran off onto the street behind the gas station and toward what looked like a thick patch of trees. Now, I screamed at her to wait, but she didn't even look back. She just kept on running in her bare feet, with that half a handcuff still dangling from one of her wrists. And then she was gone. My yelling attracted the attention of the guy who just pulled in to pump gas, and for a second, I thought that he might have been the guy the girl was running from. But when I told him everything was under control and the cops were on the way, he nodded quietly and returned to his vehicle. Since the girl was sure that she was being followed, I'd parked my car facing the whole gas station, not near a pump. But since the girl decided to run off and take her chances elsewhere, I figured that I'd do what I went there to do in the first place and actually fill up my tank. And so I got back into my car and drove around to the pumps and was opposite the guy that I'd talked to about calling the cops. Now at this point I'm just kind of reflecting on everything, but we swapped a little small talk about the girl and I explained how I'd picked her up on the highway, scared out of her mind. And he agreed it seemed like something really bad was going on, and then he wished me luck with the cops before he paid for his gas and drove off. But no sooner had he pulled out when another car came rolling into the station. It was a 4-door sedan, a pretty nice one too, and it pulled up to the pump just behind me. 3 men then got out, all real regular-looking guys, probably in their 40s or 50s, and then instead of pumping gas or walking over to the store to buy snacks, they started looking around the area like they were searching for something, or maybe someone. I'm keeping one eye on my gas pump and one eye on the guys that just pulled up, and then suddenly, the oldest of the 3 says, "Hey, you haven't seen a little lady walking around here, would you?" Now, I've always been a really bad liar, and I knew a straight no probably wouldn't pass with this guy, so when the older guy asked me if I'd seen her, I said yes. But then, instead of telling him the whole truth, I told them a version of it. I said that I'd seen a crazy-looking broad in the middle of the highway who tried to get me to stop, but since I was pretty sure she was about to try and carjack me, I kept my door locked and drove around her and sped off. I knew not to look him dead in the eyes, so I looked around him and his buddies and then asked, "Why? What's this about? She escaped from like a insane asylum or something?" And the 3 of them just sort of laughed, and I figured that I might have, sold them on my performance. But then as the older guy stayed in front of me, his 2 buddies started flanking me on either side, with one looking at my car and the other looking off in the direction that the girl actually ran. The older guy then suddenly asked me, "Did you call 911?" And again, in what was a version of the truth, I told him I had. I didn't mention anything about arranging to meet the cops at that gas station. I just said that I called them because I was worried some crazy B-word was going to end up splattered on the highway, and some poor schmuck like me was going to end up going to jail over it. I'm not saying it was an Oscar-winning performance, but I tapped into some genuine emotion there. Yet no matter how convincing I thought I was, the guy's 2 friends weren't moved in the slightest, and one of them was now looking through my car windows, clearly looking for any sign of that girl. I think those were some of the scariest, most nerve-wracking moments of my entire life, praying that girl hadn't left anything behind on the passenger seat when she'd bolted, something like a scrunchie or maybe some of her clothing. I also got terrified that I left my phone on the dash and that the guy might see a blood smear or something on that from that girl, and so you can imagine my relief when I felt the weight of it in my pocket. I was at that point I decided to be a little aggressive, and I don't mean that in a sort of I tried to fight them way. It was almost like a normal person would want to know why their car was being inspected, and that's what I asked. I turned to the guy looking into my car, and was kind of rude and standoffish when I said something like, "Hey, what are you looking for, buddy?" And he looked at me, and started backing off away from the car with nothing but a smile. The older guy then said something to the effect of, "Don't mind my friend there, he's just a curious soul." Something really creepy like that, and then they made their excuses and moved on. As I went to pay for my gas, the 3 men were still walking around the gas station. They were doing it less urgently than when they'd first arrived, more subtly too, but they were still looking for that girl. I walked up and down in that store after paying for my gas, making out like I was just an indecisive snacker, and then a few minutes after, the 3 guys got back into that sedan and left. I then made myself some coffee, ate a few protein bars while I told the clerk that whole story, and then walked outside to meet the cops when they showed up maybe 20 minutes after I'd hoped they would. I repeated the story, included the part about the 3 guys showing up, and with added emphasis on how damned unnerving this all had been, like they had the girl fitted with a tracking device or something. And that sounded like a little too sci-fi for me at first, but the more I thought about that afterwards, the more it shifted into the realm of possibility. I know I was on a lonely stretch of highway, and at this point it was almost 11 p.m., but the fact those guys seemed to know exactly where to stop, which car she'd been in, and which direction she'd run off in, it makes me think that that might have just been the case. Even the cop that I spoke to agreed that if it was some kind of kidnapping situation, the girl could have been fitted with some kind of tracking device, most probably in the handcuffs that she was still wearing when she got into my car. And before he left, one of the cops thanked me for calling it in and added that even though it had been a stressful and potentially traumatic situation, getting the police involved was the right thing to do, and meant that we were one step closer to bringing everyone involved to justice. And the guys chasing the girl had potentially made a huge mistake in getting their faces and license plate on the gas station's cameras, and if it was me that had led them there, I should feel proud of myself. It was pretty cool for him to say that, and definitely made me feel a little bit better about this whole thing, but it was also just about the only thing that really did, because all my other thoughts about it were dark and more dark, and they played out on the rest of the ride home too, which was a whole 3 hours of wondering what the hell had I almost gotten myself into. I got a call from a detective a couple of days later, and after retelling that story to him with as much detail as I could remember, I asked if the girl had been found. And according to him, they hadn't found anybody but the owner of the vehicle the men had traveled in, and that basically they were still trying to figure out what the hell was going on. The detective said if he needed to ask me anything else, he'd give me a call, but that was the last I heard from him, or any Pennsylvanian cop for that matter. And I still think about that girl every now and then. I wonder who she was, who those men chasing her were, and if she ever got far enough away from them that she wouldn't have to live scared anymore. But a part of me thinks that in the same way she wouldn't just give in, the same way she'd patiently engineered her own escape, those men chasing her won't give in so easily either, especially when she still has a voice to tell the truth about what happened to her. Some days, when I'm in a brighter mood, I like to think she got away, and that she's raising kids with a good man someplace with all that darkness being just a memory for her. But then other days, when I'm not feeling so swell, I get this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I feel like I know they got to her, and that they shut her up for good. My name's Nick, and I'm from England. Back in the mid-90s, when our son was still only 4, we went on a family holiday to Tuscany in Italy. My wife had found this incredible villa in a holiday brochure, which was up in the hills above a place called Lucalena. It looked like a little slice of paradise, and it was shockingly cheap compared to some of the less rural villas and apartments. So without delay, we booked it for 2 weeks, paid the fees and deposit, then counted the days into our dream holiday. We landed in Pisa in the late afternoon, and while our young son Tom hated the flight, he loved the ice cream that we bought him before the journey out to Lucalena. It was a good 3-hour drive from Pisa, so by the time we were within maybe half an hour of Lucalena in our village, it was completely dark. We were right out in the countryside too, so the stars above us lit up the sky, and little Tom fell asleep after staring out the window at them. My wife was struggling to stay awake by the time we came to a crossroads, and I was pretty exhausted from the day's traveling myself, so rather than make a gut decision on which path to take, I stopped the car, got my map out, and consulted it before making the appropriate turn. I reassured my wife that we were only a few miles away and that we'd be at the villa within 15 to 20 minutes, and then I drove up a steep path that leveled off at the top. Because of the slope, I couldn't see what was at the top, so I made sure to crest the hill nice and slowly to avoid any kind of collision. But then, as I did, someone jumped out of the bushes at the side of the road and was lit up by my headlights. I could see that he had a long, double-barrel shotgun in his hands, and he was aiming it right at me. I slammed on the brakes as my wife started to panic. Then I was struggling to get the car in reverse when all of a sudden I heard, "No," from outside the car. A second man had jumped out of the bushes and was lowering the first man's shotgun while telling him no. They both shot us a look of horror, realizing we were not who they thought we were. Then the second man, who stopped the first from shooting, walked over to the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. When I rolled it down, he gave me and my wife this big nervous smile as he said, "Mi dispiace molto, signore," which I knew from my Italian phrase book meant, "I'm very sorry, sir." I didn't really speak much Italian, and what little I'd learned went right out the window when that guy pointed a shotgun at me, so all I could manage in reply was, "Parle inglés?" or "Do you speak English?" And the man said, "No, no," in that melodic, drawn-out Italian way, and then said, "No English, mi dispiace." I then heard my wife ask, "Are you police? Policia?" And the man replied, "Si, policia," with the same big smile on his face, and then told us, "Avanti, vai," which just means, "Come on then, move along." And we both thanked him, and by that point, Tom had woken up in the back seat and was getting very agitated, asking, "Mommy, Daddy, who are these men?" And we told him it was the police, but they had been very friendly and were letting us go. I think my wife believed them at the time, so she was very convincing and reassuring Tom that there was nothing to worry about. But me, I didn't believe a word he'd said about being the police. I didn't say anything with Tom in earshot, and I didn't want to scare him, and arriving at the villa really took the edge off too, because it was even nicer in the flesh than it was in the brochure. But then, once we gotten Tom all tucked into bed and had a few moments to settle down, I told my wife what I'd been thinking. I told her how I didn't think those men were the police. They weren't in uniform, that shotgun looked like it had come off a farm, not from a police arsenal, and they didn't even attempt to show us any badges or identification or anything like that. And she asked me, "Well, if they weren't police, who were they?" And I replied, "The mafia." My wife just sat down in bed in silence as I made my case, and when I was done, it made sense to her too. A couple of mafiosos had been waiting to ambush someone, and they thought that person was us. The only thing that stopped us freaking out completely was that we were at least a couple of miles away from that ambush site, so the chances of running into them again seemed minimal. She suggested we call the police in the hopes they had an English speaker down at the station, but even if they did, I wasn't sure that was a good idea. The idea of rocking the boat like that made me feel even more nervous than having that shotgun pointed at me and my family, because while that whole thing had apparently been a mistake, having us snitching on the local mafia on our first day in Italy was a deliberate act that might well bring us some undue attention. I'm not saying it was an easy decision to make. I was furious that some idiot had pointed a gun at us, but it quickly became a question of, if we're going to be staying there for 2 weeks, what was the course of action that was going to keep us safest? And that's how we decided to honor that age-old mafia tradition of keeping our bloody mouths shut. The next day, we decided to walk down to Lusalena to do some exploring, and that's how we found this little bar that served paninis, espresso, and assortment of little pastries. I got a coffee, and then while my wife and son got Cokes and played around with the table football set in the little games room they had, I sat at the bar and discovered the bartender actually spoke English. We talked back and forth, and he gave me some restaurant recommendations. Then suddenly, a group of older men who were drinking coffee and playing cards started gesturing toward the bar's television. The bartender turned up the TV, which was showing us a news report of some kind. I asked the bartender what it was about, and after listening to the news lady speak for a minute or so, he turned back to me and said, "There's been a murder, not far from here. This was a businessman who got killed. Terrible thing." I asked him exactly how far away the murder had been, and after consulting with some of the older men, the bartender confirmed my suspicions. It had taken place in almost the exact spot where those armed men had jumped out of the bushes ready to fire at us. I didn't rush to tell the wife. I didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was. But later that day, once we were back at the villa and getting ready to head out for dinner, I told her about the murder. Again, it wasn't like anything we could do about it, or rather, it was nothing we were willing to stick our necks out over by getting involved with local crime. The best thing we could do was try to forget about it, head to Lusalena and enjoy some incredible home-cooked food. It was so good that our young son Tom suddenly didn't mind trying new things when they were all so delicious. And so we ate our fill, and when we were all finished, we asked for the bill. The waiter then comes out with the restaurant's owner. Then the pair of them explain in very broken English that the meal had already been paid for. Then when I asked who the generous person was, they explained that it was someone we'd had a misunderstanding with. At first, my wife and I didn't make the connection, and we tried explaining there hadn't been any kind of misunderstanding. We loved the food, and we wanted nothing more than to support their business by paying our bill. But the owner insisted. Our money was no good there. Then when we ate there again the second night, with every intention of leaving a large tip, they once again explained our food was free. But by then, we'd figured out who was paying for our meals. It was the mafia. It didn't happen anywhere else, and we made sure to visit plenty of other places because we felt terrible. I mean, as far as we knew, the mafia hadn't really paid for our food, and those poor people were being forced to cook for free. But then, every time we did eat there, they seemed really happy to see us, and the waiter would always bring our gelato for our 4-year-old son without us asking for it. My wife didn't always approve of all that ice cream, but you better believe Tom did. That made us think that maybe those mafia guys really were paying the owners for all our food, and that they were running a little scam of their own and giving us as much as possible so they could claim it all back from the mafia. But since we didn't see them ever again, I suppose we'll never know. They never reached out to us, and we didn't see those 2 armed guys around the village at all, but I suppose it was probably a case of they saw us, we just didn't see them. It was an amazing but very intense holiday, but the next time we visited Italy, we went to a completely different part of the country and had no repeat encounters with any nocturnal assassins. We had to pay for all our meals, which my wallet definitely wasn't thanking me for, but we still found that second holiday much more relaxing than the first. So, I live in Chicago, and the job I was working at the time had me on 12 till 10 shifts. So 12 in the PM to 10 in the PM, 6 nights a week, and sometimes I wouldn't actually get out of the place till maybe 10:30, so I'd always be driving home late, and I hated it. Right when I was at my lowest, my most hungry, my most tired, Chicago's crazies and outlaws would be hitting the streets to do whatever they do at night. Sometimes I'd bump into one outside the liquor store when I'd stop by to buy smokes. Sometimes I'd make it all the way to the parking lot of my apartment building before someone jumped out of our dumpsters to start trying to rob me. I got used to it after a while. I still hated it, but I was used to my driving home having this crazy edge to it. But then one night, it got way more crazy than usual. So I was driving along one night, and it had been a pretty quiet one so far. I'd done my liquor store run, stopped to buy some groceries from a late-night store, and both stops had been nice and quiet. I figured that I might have gotten lucky on the old crazies front, but once I was back on the road, there was an incident. I think it started when one of the cars ahead of me tried to pass another because there was a loud honk of a horn before someone in one of the cars stuck their arm out of a window to flip the other one off. No such passing took place, so the 2 cars drove one behind the other until the second set of lights we reached, at which point they managed to draw level with each other. I was right behind them by this point, with one car dead ahead of me and the other just to the right, and they're both right at the head of traffic on the stop line. I remember thinking, if they're going to do anything, it's coming now. And I wasn't wrong, because after that, the passenger in the car on the left flipped the other car off. I thought they might start yelling at each other through open windows before the light turned green, but the driver in front of me opened up his door, climbed out of his driver's seat, and then walked towards the other car before slamming his fist into the passenger window. He started yelling, "Get out and say that to my face, mother effer." but the passenger door didn't open. I thought, uh-oh, these guys don't want the smoke, because they didn't roll down their window or open their doors, and I figured they were just going to zoom off when the lights turned green because they'd messed with the wrong dude. But looking back, I think it was more like the other way around. The man who got out of his car didn't know who he was messing with. The lights turned green, and the cars on either side of us started getting back on the move, but everyone who was stuck behind me in the two cars started honking and yelling for them to make a move. The guy out of his car yelled at everyone to shut up and mind their business, which kind of made me laugh at the same time because we're all literally just trying to get where we're going and this dude's stopping us. But as the guy's yelling at the cars behind, the passenger side window he'd just been punching started to lower, before stopping maybe halfway down. I'm also guessing the guy heard something from inside the car because he turned to look just in time for me to see two flashes and hear two bangs. It was like a real quick pop-pop, and I knew instantly from the sound that it was shots fired before the car that it came from suddenly sped off at what must have been 80 to 90 miles per hour. At first, I thought the shots missed because the guy that got shot at didn't move or react or anything. He just kind of stood there and watched the car speed off. But then he turned to walk back to his own car, and I realized the shots, or at least one of them, hadn't missed. The guy looked fine, but then, like I said, he turned, and I saw the shots had carved away a huge section of skin and muscle around what I'm guessing was his right eye. He kind of staggered as he walked, with all this blood pouring out of his head, and then I remember how he put a hand up to his head and saw the blood on his hand when he pulled it away. If that was me, I'd have been freaking out, but the guy barely even reacted. He just sort of kept stumbling towards his car for another step or two before his legs seemed to stop working altogether. I saw the moment he realized it too, like he looked down maybe thinking his foot was caught on something, but it wasn't. And I'm guessing one of the bullets scrambled his brain or something because he just sort of lost the ability to walk. Then he fell down, just onto his knees first and then onto his hands too. He reached out for his door like he was trying to grab it for stability, and I could see his fingers gripping and tensing like it was just within reach. Only it wasn't. The car door was at least a foot or two away, but I guess from how messed up his vision was, he couldn't tell, and then he passed out reaching for something he'd never feel. I remember hearing someone behind me honking their horn and yelling out of their window at me to move, but then in the moment after the shots were fired, it was like a starter gun for pure chaos. Cars are zooming left and right, trying to get the hell away because they still don't know where the shots were coming from or if the shooter was still active. For me, shit, all I did was freeze, looking up at that guy's body. You could see bone, like a pinky white underneath the flesh that had been ripped away by either one or both of the bullets, and blood was pouring from what looked like a hole in his skull. It was probably one of the worst things I'd ever seen, but I couldn't look away. And I ended up calling 911 and joined a bunch of people who'd walked out from the sidewalk to see if they could help the guy, but we could all see how bad he was hurt, and I think he was dead by the time the EMTs got him on a stretcher. I told the cops everything I'd seen, but I hadn't managed to get the shooter's license plate either. Or I mean, the car that had the shooter in its passenger seat. After that, I was free to go, but it wasn't over for me, not by a long shot. I had a couple of nightmares where I'd see the guy's face all messed up like it was, and I didn't realize how badly the thing had me messed up until I ended up getting super sick. I wasn't sleeping properly, and I wasn't eating well, and I wasn't getting outside enough. And I guess after a while it all came to a head, and I ended up talking to a girl I knew about it who recommended therapy. And I can't say it worked wonders for me, like it definitely wasn't just a couple of appointments and then I was cured. But it definitely helped me rationalize things, and over time, it helped me get to the stage where I could finally start living normally again. So I understand that you're a submission-driven channel, and after hearing the story of an English journalist in a video titled Wrong Turns, I am reminded of one of my own well-worn tales. You see, although I have long since retired, I too worked as a member of the press, and from the late 1960s to the early 2000s, I wrote dispatches for the likes of the Times, the BBC, and the Associated Press. And my career took me all over the world, from Africa to the Americas to the Far and the Middle East. But perhaps no place on Earth has affected me more acutely than the one I'll write about today. And that place is Afghanistan. So on Christmas Eve of 1979, and after a period of political instability for their marionettes in the Afghan government, Soviet paratroopers jumped from the skies over Kabul and captured the capital's airport. The next day, the Soviets confirmed what the world already knew. They invaded Afghanistan and they were there to stay. My colleagues and I were gripped, and for two reasons. The first was that if Afghanistan fell, the Soviets had almost unimpeded access to India, a nation they'd been courting away from the West for quite some time. And for the second was all of the empires and great powers that had tried to subdue Afghanistan, not a single one had achieved its long-term goals of controlling it. The Persians tried, the Greeks tried, then the Mongols, and the British tried, on 3 separate occasions in the case of the latter. But no one ever managed to conquer what became known as the graveyard of empires. Then again, the Mongols only had steppe ponies, not thousands of cutting-edge battle tanks, and so at first, all bets were on for the Soviets. But it's a good thing they weren't made with a bookmaker, otherwise a lot of people would have lost a lot of money. At first, rural resistance melted away in the face of the Soviets' overwhelmingly superior firepower. But as the spring fighting season kicked off in March of 1980, the native Mujahideen, which roughly translates to holy warriors, came back with a vengeance, quite literally in some cases. As ambushes on Soviet convoys increased, the country they'd once declared conquered didn't quite seem so conquered anymore. And as 1981 rolled into 1982, Soviet casualty numbers kept on rising. But as the number of Russian deaths rose, so did international interest in the plucky rebels who had swapped their shepherding crooks for AK-47s, and were giving the Russians as good as they got. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where your humble narrator enters the story. One of the largest backers of the Afghan Mujahideen, aside from the Gulf Arabs, was the United States, who channeled their support through the friendly nation of Pakistan. Weapons, ammunition, food, and medicine were all smuggled through the mountain passes of the Afghan-Pakistan border. The same applied to journalists, too, and once editors discovered they could send us in and out without getting us killed, they started issuing assignments left and right. They were all voluntary, of course. You could opt out if you so wished, and men with families and young children often did. Me, on the other hand, I was young, single, and eager to prove myself. So I flew to Peshawar, Pakistan, not far from the Afghan border. In Peshawar, I met a man named Naveed, an Afghan who'd been studying English at Kabul University before the invasion. Many of his fellow intellectuals were supporters of the Afghan communist regime, so they welcomed the Red Army with open arms. Naveed saw things differently, and unfortunately for him, his colleagues were all too aware of it. Naveed fled Kabul once people started getting arrested, and he joined the Mujahideen. But since he spoke English almost fluently, he was of much better use in the rear with a telephone than on the front lines with an AK-47. His job was to be the Mujahideen's mouthpiece in garnering international support for their cause, and as a result, he was well known among the many Afghan refugees taking shelter in Peshawar. When I first arrived, Naveed took me to an Afghan chai khana, which translates as tea house, where many of the country's refugees congregated. He introduced me to a woman who lost all 7 of her children when Soviet helicopter gunships targeted her village. She was a broken woman, dead behind those eyes, who claimed the only thing keeping her alive was the hope of seeing the communists driven from her homeland. I met several other people with similar stories, people who'd borne the brunt of their occupiers' attempt to drag Afghanistan into their unholy empire. At the end of the day, Naveed asked if I was ready to meet the people fighting for those refugees and for their right to return. I'd never been more ready for anything in my life, so the next morning, we began planning our journey into Afghanistan. Naveed told me that Soviet helicopters patrolled the border regions by day, meaning we had no choice but to travel by night if we wanted to avoid them. But crossing the borders by night was potentially even more dangerous than crossing by day. It wasn't just the Mujahideen or Spetsnaz operatives we'd have to be careful of either. Bandits roamed the areas which were prone to landslides, and the mountains are also home to wolves, bears, and snow leopards, all of which would be only too happy to make a meal out of stranded motorists. There was a bloody good chance we'd end up stranded too, as the only car Naveed could get his hands on was an old Tajik jalopy that only seemed to start after Naveed said a complex series of prayerful invocations. But even with everything stacked against us, there was no way that I was about to turn around and head home without at least trying to do my job. So that evening, once the sun was sinking low, we climbed into the car and off we went. As we drove away from Peshawar, the road rose to meet us as we drove closer and closer to the mountains. They loomed large in the distance like a family of sleeping giants, silhouetted by the orange glow of the setting sun. I drove for the first few hours since I could quite easily navigate by the remaining daylight, but then once twilight started to set in, we pulled over to the side of the road and Naveed took a turn driving. He'd been given detailed instructions to follow by his Mujahideen contact, and this route was the only one which would guarantee our safety, so it was crucial we followed said instructions to the letter. Fortunately, Naveed knew the mountain passes like the back of his hand. There was just one small problem. He was a terrible sufferer of migraines. It had been full dark for about an hour when I noticed him beginning to rub his eyes every couple of minutes, and then when he cursed under his breath, closed his eyes and began pinching the bridge of his nose, I could stay silent no longer. I asked if he was okay and if there was anything I could do to help. He explained he suffered terrible headaches, and so after giving him a couple of pills to alleviate the pain, I took over in the driver's seat for a while. But this only caused Naveed's headache to worsen. You see, as an Englishman, I was taught to drive on the left-hand side of the road. This is usually the case for those who grew up in Commonwealth countries, as they're generally taught in the style of their former compatriots. But the same cannot be said for Afghanistan. Afghans might have inherited our love for cricket, but they did not inherit our motoring sensibilities, and every so often I'd hear Naveed in the passenger seat saying, "Mr. David, please, you must drive on the right." I'd apologize and correct myself, but in trying to follow his instructions as I peered out into the darkness beyond our headlights, I'd find my old instincts kicking in again, prompting another word of warning from Naveed. Eventually, he gave up, declaring, "Drive on whatever side you want, Mr. David, but be prepared for heaven if you stray for the right." I tried, I really did, but habits are hard things to break, even when your personal safety is on the line, and while it didn't cause an accident, my driving may or may not have contributed to us taking a wrong turn. We first realized when Naveed gave me an instruction to make a turn. I waited for it, trundling along no faster than 10 miles an hour maybe, so I wouldn't miss it. And then I waited, and waited, and waited some more, but still no alternate path presented itself. I told Naveed that I think we missed the turn, or that I might have made a mistake further back and driven us down the wrong track. Every time Naveed got annoyed with me, he'd say, "God forgive me," in Arabic, and you can bet your arse he let out one hell of an astaghfirullah after I admitted to the wrong turn. If we weren't on the road the Mujahideen were expecting us to be on, we were in a very precarious position, but turning back might end up with us getting lost even further. We had to simply push on and hope Naveed started to recognize our surroundings, because if worse came to worse, we might end up running into some Russian special forces, which would be compromising to a permanent end, as they say. Naveed's migraine was at peak painfulness by then, possibly from the stress of having me drive him around, But this also meant that there was no switching over. I was the driver for the foreseeable future, and unfortunately that meant driving on the left-hand side of the road. And so we pushed on, driving along winding mountain roads in almost pitched darkness, while Naveed struggled with both his migraine and navigation. I kept us going as best I could, sticking to the track and moving slowly and steadily. But then suddenly, a large floodlight burst into life ahead of us, and we were instantly blinded. I heard somebody suddenly barking at us in Pashto, a language only Naveed understood, and he started to get out of the car and then told me to follow with my hands in the air. I'd been in some very sticky situations during my career, but nothing quite as hair-raising as that. We didn't know if they were mujahideen, government troops loyal to the Russians, bandits, or Spetsnaz operators who just so happened to have learned enough Pashto to order us out of the car. The man behind the light shouted another order once we'd slammed the doors closed. Then Naveed told me to do as he did and began walking towards the light. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how I die. Shot by some Afghan bandit for my fancy boots and sunglasses. Or perhaps tortured to death by Russian special forces, convinced I'm some kind of American spy. But after a few slow steps that dragged out into what felt like much, much longer, a voice behind the light called out a soft question that included the word Naveed. Naveed's demeanor changed instantly, like he just heard his lottery numbers called out or something. And I later learned that he said, yes, it's me, Naveed," in Pashto, at which point the entire situation turned on its head. His mujahideen comrades shut off the spotlight at their checkpoint and then began walking towards us, lowering their weapons as they laughed. The men began hugging each other and saying their salams before Naveed introduced me to the men. They seemed very pleased to meet me, which was a huge relief. Yet after a round of handshakes, there seemed to be a lot of excited gesticulation between Naveed and his friends. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but what I could gather is that after Naveed's friends asked him a round of questions, they began explaining something about the route we'd just taken. One of the mujahideen pointed to the road behind us, and Naveed seemed to turn around in horror for a moment before turning back. Then after a few sentences of what I can only assume was explanation, Naveed turned to me and embraced me so hard it forced the wind out of my lungs. "Thank you, Mr. David," he said. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." I patted him on the back, feeling nothing but confusion as he trembled against me. And then after stepping away and wiping a tear from his eye, Naveed began to translate what he'd just been told. The route Naveed had been given by his friends in the Mujahideen had been a very specific one, as it was just the only path in the entire province that wasn't either mined or covered by Soviet checkpoints. And the road we'd just driven down had been positively littered with pressure plate IEDs. Naveed's friends had wanted to know how the hell we hadn't blown ourselves to smithereens, and after a few questions of his own, Naveed figured out why. To save on resources, the Mujahideen wanted to plant their explosives in the most effective places possible. So when they booby-trapped a stretch of road they were expecting the Russians to drive down, they planted their bombs in a very specific place to make sure the explosions were as close as possible to enemy vehicles, and that place was the right-hand side of the road. It wasn't just the Afghans who stuck to the right side of the road while driving. The Russians did too. Then when the Afghans noticed, they realized the best place to hide a rigged artillery shell was in the dirt off the right-hand side of the road. That meant that in sticking to the left, I avoided the ones with pressure plate detonators and prevented us from being blown to bits in a heartbeat. And when I realized this, the knee-wobbling thrill of the near-death experience kicked in hard. The Mujahideen commander was reportedly furious that we'd almost wasted his explosives and exposed his men's positions to the Russians. But by the time we reached him, he'd calmed considerably and shared the opinion of his men that we were somehow blessed by God. I conducted an interview with the commander and spent some time at a Mujahideen camp taking photographs and interviewing fighters. Then, after a few days, Naveed and I climbed back into the Tajik Jalopy and drove back to Peshawar with a motor vehicle outrider, ensuring that we didn't take another wrong turn. I had my story, Naveed had his payment for being my fixer, and my editor back in London was over the moon. We had a scoop that would turn the other broadsheets green with envy, and I was heading home without so much as a sprained ankle. So all in all, it was a huge success, and I was free to move on to my next assignment. At least on paper I was free, because what I'd experienced ensured that there was some small part of me that would forever remain in Afghanistan. I made 2 more trips to the country, one in 1992 and one in 2001, shortly after the American invasion. My second trip in '92 filled me with hope that the warring factions could put aside their differences following the Soviet withdrawal and the defeat of the communist government. But that hope was sadly misplaced. I thought Afghanistan would get itself back on track, so to speak, and return to a trajectory of prosperity. But, as you know, thanks to a man named Osama bin Laden among many others, Afghanistan was doomed to another 20 years of war, factionalism, and ultimately, suffering. I've never quite lost my sense of hope for that place. There's still a holdout somewhere in my heart that refuses to give up the ghost. But as each day goes by, I come to realize that if Afghanistan has peace and prosperity in its future, it certainly won't be arriving in my lifetime. Or rather, what little of it I have left to enjoy. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if you're missing an AirPod, dig in yo butt.